The second notice wasn't in my mailbox. It was taped to my front door, the paper crinkled and smudged as if handled with angry, impatient fingers. The fines were now accruing, it said. The threat of a lien on our home was now explicitly stated. But it was the postscript, handwritten in a tight, furious script that made my blood run cold. You can't hide behind your lawyer husband forever. Some of us actually work for a living. The handwritten postscript changed everything. It was no longer a faceless, bureaucratic fight. It was personal, venomous, and terrifyingly close to home. They knew about Mark. They'd taken the time to find out who he was and to use his profession as a slur. Elena's hands were ice-cold as she showed it to him. Mark's lawyerly calm evaporated. His face, usually a mask of reasoned composure, darkened with a protective anger she rarely saw. "This is harassment," he said, his voice low and tight. He carefully placed the notice in a clear plastic sleeve, handling it by the corner. "This changes the game entirely." The pristine, orderly world of Silver Oaks began to feel like a gilded cage. Their morning run felt different. Where neighbors once offered vague, polite smiles, now they averted their eyes. Mrs. Gable, who lived 2 doors down and whose prize-winning roses were the talk of the subdivision, actually crossed the street to avoid passing them. The division was most starkly illustrated at the neighborhood mailbox cluster the next day. Elena arrived to find a small group of women gathered, including Cynthia Carlyle. Their conversation died the moment they saw her. Cynthia, a woman whose blonde bob was always perfect and whose athleisure wear looked never sweated in, offered a thin, razor-sharp smile. "Elena, I see you got our follow-up notice." The other women studied their nails, the sky, anything but. "Elena, I did, Cynthia, along with what I believe constitutes criminal harassment." Cynthia's smile didn't falter. "Harassment? Goodness, that's a strong word. Our property manager is just very thorough. He must have jotted a note to himself and forgotten to type the final letter. A simple mistake." The lie was so bald, so effortless, it took Elena's breath away. It was a threat. A threat? Cynthia gave a tinkling, humorless laugh. "We're a homeowners association, Elena, not a cartel. We're just trying to maintain a certain standard. For everyone's good, your little experiment is bringing down the character of the entire street. The Jeffersons are worried it will attract rodents. The Robinsons are concerned about their son's allergies." She said experiment, the way one might say contagious disease. Elena felt the eyes of the other women on her, their silence a wall of judgment. She was an outsider, a disruptor of their carefully curated peace. "It's a native plant garden, Cynthia. It uses less water, supports pollinators, and it's legal under state law." Cynthia's eyes glinted. "State law is one thing. The contract you signed when you bought your home is another. We have lawyers too, Elena." She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was far more menacing than a shout. "Is this really the hill you want to die on? A bunch of weeds?" The confrontation left Elena shaken and furious. She felt isolated, branded as the difficult one, the troublemaker. That afternoon, as she was carefully pruning a particularly vigorous patch of frostweed, a voice from the sidewalk startled her. "It's beautiful." Elena turned. A young woman she'd seen jogging before was standing there, a baby strapped to her chest in a carrier. She looked hesitant, as if speaking was an act of defiance. "Thank you," Elena said, wary after the morning's events. "I'm Chloe. I live on the next street over. I walk by here just to see it. My husband and we want to do something like this. The water bill for this stupid grass is astronomical." Elena felt a surge of hope so powerful it was almost dizzying. She wasn't alone. "It's not hard," she said, her voice softening. "I can give you a list of plants, show you where I got them." Chloe's face lit up, then quickly clouded. "I'd love that, but our HOA—" "I know," Elena said. "Believe me, I know." They spoke for 10 minutes, a hushed, hurried conversation on the sidewalk. It was a connection, a tiny crack in the wall of opposition. But as Chloe walked away with a promise to email her, Elena saw a curtain twitch in the Carlisle house. She was being watched. That night, Mark laid out the legal strategy. The Texas Property Code is clear. An HOA cannot prohibit xeriscaping or water-efficient landscaping. They can have reasonable guidelines about aesthetics, but they can't outright ban it. Their covenants are likely unenforceable on this point. We'll send a formal cease and desist letter regarding the harassment and a legal brief citing the precedent. It sounded strong. It sounded winnable. But as Eleanor tried to sleep, the image of Cynthia Carlisle's cold, smiling face wouldn't leave her. She wasn't fighting a rational entity. She was fighting an ideology, a cult of conformity. The law was on her side, but the law was a blunt instrument. It couldn't stop the whispers, the dirty looks, the feeling of being an outcast in her own community. She got up and looked out the bedroom window at her moonlit garden. The silvery light painted the landscape in shades of charcoal and pearl, the forms of the plants looking strong and ancient. It was her pride, her joy. But tonight, it also looked like a target. She thought of the handwritten note. Some of us actually work for a living. The words weren't just an insult, they were a reminder. They knew who she was. They knew where she lived. The law was one battlefield. Her street, her neighborhood was another. And on that field, she was terrifyingly outnumbered. The legal brief from Mark's firm should have been a checkmate. It cited precedent, state law, and threatened legal action for harassment. We thought it would force a retreat. We were wrong. The response wasn't a white flag. It was a declaration of total war. And the first casualty wasn't our case. It was our sense of safety. The morning after we sent it, we found the first plant ripped from the earth, its roots bleeding dirt onto the pristine sidewalk. The vandalized plant was a Turk's cap, a vibrant red hummingbird magnet she had nurtured from a single spindly cutting. It lay on its side, its roots exposed to the harsh morning sun, the dark. Soil around it torn up like a wound. It wasn't just destroyed, it was desecrated. The violence of the act, its petty cruelty, left Elena standing frozen on her porch, a mug of coffee turning cold in her hand. Mark was out the door first, his face a storm cloud. He didn't even bother with shoes. He scanned the street, but it was empty, silent save for the distant hum of a lawnmower. The perfect suburban stillness was now a taunt. Anyone could have done it. Everyone was a suspect. He called the police. A single officer arrived an hour later, took notes with an air of profound boredom, and called it criminal mischief. He suggested it was probably kids. Elena wanted to scream. Kids didn't carefully target a single native plant in a garden they'd call weeds. Kids didn't leave the expensive solar lights untouched. This was a message. The incident, however, had an unintended effect. The story, juicy and dramatic, spread through Silver Oak's digital veins. The community Facebook page, usually a forum for lost pets and complaints about garbage collection schedules, exploded. Cynthia Carlisle was the first to post. Her message, a masterpiece of performative concern. So saddened to hear about the vandalism on Mockingbird Lane. This kind of behavior has no place in our community. Let's all remember to be kind and respectful, even when we disagree. The comments underneath were a battlefield. Respectful? How is a yard full of weeds respectful to the rest of us who follow the rules? Brenda Robinson. Maybe if the yard was in compliance, this wouldn't have happened. Just saying. Anonymous user. This is terrifying. What if it's kids? What's next? Susan Jeffers. But then, other voices emerged, tentatively at first, then with more courage. Destroying someone's property is never the answer. That garden is actually really pretty. Chloe Miller. My cousin did a native yard and his water bill was cut in half. Maybe the HOA rules need to change with the times. David Chen. I've lived here for 20 years, and this is the first time I've been ashamed of my neighbors. Arthur Gable. Elena scrolled through the comments, her emotions seesawing between vindication and a sickening dread. She was no longer just a homeowner with a violation. She was a catalyst, fracturing the community into armed camps. She saw Chloe's name and felt a surge of gratitude, followed immediately by fear for her. She was making herself a target too. The next day, a small pot of yellow primroses appeared on Elena's porch with a note. Don't let them win. A friend. It was unsigned. That tiny act of defiance should have warmed her. Instead, it felt like a confirmation that the conflict was escalating beyond letters and lawyers into something shadowy and unpredictable. She had allies, but they were hiding. Her enemy was everywhere. The formal response from the HOA's attorney arrived via certified mail. It was a cold, dense 5-page document that acknowledged receipt of Mark's brief before systematically attempting to dismantle it. They argued that the state law was vague and that the HOA's aesthetic guidelines were indeed reasonable. They claimed Elena's garden was not xeriscaping, but uncontrolled growth that could harbor pests and present a fire hazard. They dismissed the vandalism as an unfortunate and unrelated incident. Most chillingly, they included a new motion to be voted on at an emergency HOA board meeting in 1 week, a special assessment of $5,000 from every homeowner to create a legal defense fund to fight this frivolous challenge to the covenants. Mark read it at the kitchen table, his knuckles white as he gripped the pages. They're geniuses, he said, his voice full of a grim admiration. This isn't about us anymore. They're making it about everyone's wallet. They're telling the whole neighborhood that we are the reason their HOA dues might go up. They're turning everyone against us. Elena understood instantly. It was a masterstroke. The people on the fence, those who might quietly support her or not care either way, would now be motivated by the oldest motivator of all: money. Nobody would want to pay $5,000 because their neighbor wanted to plant milkweed. She looked from the legal document to the window, where the uprooted Turk's cap lay like a corpse. The fight was no longer about principles or pollinators. It was a brutal political war for the soul of the neighborhood, and the other side had just raised an army funded by fear and spite. The walls were closing in, and the air in her own home began to feel thin and dangerous. The emergency HOA meeting was a public shaming disguised as civility. They didn't just want compliance, they wanted surrender. As Cynthia Carlyle took the podium, her smile was a scalpel. She called for a vote to bankrupt us with legal fees. But as hands began to rise, a voice from the back of the room, old and cracking with emotion, shouted, "I'll not pay a dime for this bullying!" The room erupted, and in the chaos, I saw the first real crack in their perfect, polished armor. The community clubhouse was packed, the air thick with a mix of expensive perfume, aftershave, and palpable tension. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, a mockery of democratic process. Eleanor and Mark took seats near the back, a strategic island in a sea of hostile glances. She felt like a defendant walking to the gallows. Cynthia Carlyle presided from a small dais at the front, flanked by the rest of the HOA board. She looked polished and pitiless, a queen holding court. She began with a saccharine speech about community, standards, and the importance of protecting property values for everyone. She spoke of shared sacrifice and standing united. Then she got to the point. "A small minority," she said, her eyes flicking toward Elena without actually landing, "has chosen to place their personal preferences above the agreed-upon rules that bind us all. Their refusal to comply is now forcing us to take legal measures to uphold our covenants. To that end, the board is proposing a special assessment of $5,000 per household to establish a legal defense fund. A low murmur rippled through the room. $5,000. It was a number designed to cause pain. Cynthia held up a hand. I know it's a significant amount, but think of it as an investment in the future of Silver Oaks. If we don't defend, our rules now, what's to stop the next person from wanting to paint their house neon pink or park a boat on their lawn? This is about precedent. Brenda Robinson was the first to speak, leaping to her feet. I move we vote immediately. I, for one, am tired of my property value being dragged down. I'll pay to make this problem go away. A few voices grunted. In agreement, Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. They were going to be steamrolled. Mark shifted beside her, ready to stand and object, to quote law until he was blue in the face. But before he could, a sound cut through the murmur. It was a thump, the sound of a cane hitting the floor. All heads turned. Old Mr. Gable, who lived in the original model home on the street, was struggling to his feet. His face, a roadmap of wrinkles, was flushed with fury. You sit down, Brenda. Robinson! He barked, his voice stronger than his frame suggested. And you, Cynthia Carlyle, you should be ashamed of yourself. A stunned silence fell. Mr. Gable was a fixture, a quiet man who mostly kept to himself. He'd never spoken at a meeting before. $5,000, he scoffed, to sue a neighbor over her garden. Have you all lost your minds? I've lived in this development since they poured the first foundation. I remember when this was all just fields and scrub. Elena's yard. It reminds me of what was here, before you all came with your bags of fertilizer and your noisy leaf blowers. It's the only interesting thing on this whole damn street. Cynthia's smile was frozen, a rictus of panic. Now, Arthur, we appreciate your perspective, but the rules are stupid, he shouted, thumping his cane again. They're for people with no imagination. I'll not pay a dime for this bullying, not one dime. And if you pass this thing, I'll sue the HOA myself for misuse of funds. The dam broke. The meeting erupted into chaos. He's right, shouted David Chen, standing up. This is insane. My wife and I support Elena. It's a slippery slope. A man Elena didn't know yelled back. We can't just let people do whatever they want. It's a native plant garden, not a meth lab, for God's sake. Chloe Miller cried out, her baby in her arms. The room fractured into a dozen arguing factions. The vote was forgotten. It was no longer a unified bloc against Elena. It was neighbor against neighbor, friend against friend. The perfect, placid surface of Silver Oaks had been shattered, revealing the turbulent disagreements beneath. Cynthia banged a gavel, her composure finally cracking. Order! We will have order! But the order was gone. Elena watched, a strange numbness settling over her. This was what she had wanted, wasn't it? Support, validation. But seeing it happen, seeing the raw, angry division she had caused, felt like a hollow victory. She had wanted to change minds, not start a civil war. The meeting devolved into shouting. Mark leaned close, his voice low in her ear. This is good, he said, a tactical glint in his eye. They're divided. They can't pass the assessment now. Their funding is gone. Eleanor nodded mechanically. It was a tactical win. But as she looked at Mr. Gable, red-faced and magnificent, in his anger, and at the furious, twisted faces of her opponents, she didn't feel like a winner. She felt like a bomb that had gone off. She had won the battle by burning the village down, and she knew with a cold certainty that the other side would not forgive this humiliation. The war was about to get much, much dirtier. The division was my weapon, but it was also my curse. Winning the battle over the special assessment felt like a triumph until the retaliation began. It started small, a keyed car in the grocery store parking lot, a subscription to dozens of bizarre magazines in Mark's name. Then, the anonymous online review for his law firm, accusing him of unethical practices. They weren't fighting my garden anymore. They were trying to salt the earth of our entire lives. The victory in the meeting room was Pyrrhic. The special assessment was tabled indefinitely, a direct result of the community fracture Elena had inadvertently caused. But the cost was a toxic, simmering rancor that seeped into every corner of their lives. Silver Oaks was no longer a neighborhood. It was a cold war zone with clearly drawn lines. The first attack was against Mark. It was a Friday evening when he got the email from a senior partner, a man who played golf with Cynthia Carlisle's husband. The subject line was "Client Concern." Attached was a screenshot of a review on a legal directory site. Mark Martinez of Fletcher & Gray is unprofessional and unethical. He uses his position to bully neighbors and circumvent legally binding in contracts. I would not trust this man with a parking ticket. The review was posted by an anonymous user. Mark's face went ashen. In a prestigious firm, reputation was everything. "It's libelous," he muttered, his fingers flying across his keyboard to begin the process of having it removed. But the damage wasn't in the words themselves. It was in the fact that his bosses had seen it. It was a stain, a whisper campaign made digital. "They know where I work," he said, his voice hollow. The professional facade he'd maintained throughout the fight finally showed a deep crack. "This isn't about the yard anymore, Elena. This is about destroying us." The next morning, as Elena loaded groceries into her car, she noticed the long, jagged scratch etched into the driver's side door of her Prius. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. A deep gouge from front fender to back, slicing through the paint to the metal beneath. She stood in the supermarket parking lot, her hands trembling on the cart, a cold dread washing over her. She was being watched, followed. She drove straight to a hardware store and bought a security camera. That afternoon, Mark mounted it under the eave of the porch, its unblinking eye trained on the yard and the street beyond. It felt like a surrender of a different kind, an admission that their home was no longer a sanctuary, but a fortress under siege. The most insidious attack, however, was the one that targeted their sanity. It started with the magazines, dozens of them arriving daily: Cat Fancy, Modern Ferret, Truck Trader, Guns and Ammo, obscure academic journals on Icelandic history. They were all addressed to Mark. Cancelling them was a bureaucratic nightmare of automated phone trees and customer service reps. Then came the pizza. At 2 a.m., a delivery driver rang the bell holding 6 large pies, paid for with a credit card in Mark's name. The following night, it was a taxi, idling in the driveway, insisting he'd been called for a pickup to the airport. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts. It was designed to exhaust, to annoy, to fray their nerves to breaking point. Every ring of the doorbell, every ping of a new email, every piece of mail became a source of anxiety. Elena tried to find solace in her garden, but even that was tainted. The vandalized Turk's cap had been replanted, but it stood lopsided, a Saitiya scar in the midst of the thriving growth. She found herself looking over her shoulder, jumping at every rustle in the bushes, wondering if it was the wind or another human hand poised to destroy. One afternoon, Chloe from down the street came, over her face drawn with worry. She spoke in a hushed tone on the porch, not daring to come inside. I wanted to check on you," she said. "People are saying things, crazy things." "What kind of things?" Eleanor asked, her stomach clenching. "That you're being investigated by the city for code violations. That you're trying to start some kind of eco-collective to take over the HOA. That Mark's firm is about to fire him." Chloe twisted her hands. "I know it's not true, but just be careful. The people who are still on Cynthia's side, they're angry. They feel like you made fools of them." After Chloe left, Eleanor sat on her porch step, the weight of it all pressing down on her. The camera above her head felt like a monument to her paranoia. The beautiful, resilient plants in front of her felt like a liability. She had fought for this principle, for the right to have a yard that made sense. But the principle had a body count, their peace, their privacy, Mark's professional standing. She thought about the anonymous note. Uproot it, or we will. They were doing exactly that. Not with a single violent act of destruction, but slowly, methodically, they were trying to uproot their entire lives from the community. They were salting the earth, so nothing, not even their will to fight, could grow here again. Tears of frustration and fear welled in her eyes. Winning in a court of law suddenly seemed like a meaningless abstraction. How do you prosecute a ghost? How do you sue a community for your own isolation? The law could give her the right to her garden, but it couldn't force her neighbors to stop hating her for it. And she was beginning to wonder if any patch of earth was worth this. The letter from the State Attorney General's office was a thunderclap. It wasn't a notice of a hearing or a request for information. It was a cease and desist order issued to the Silver Oaks HOA. The state was intervening. We had won. But as reporters began calling and news vans parked on our street, the victory felt fragile. The spotlight was our protection, but it was also a target, and that's when I found it. Nailed to my front door, right over the camera's view, a single dead monarch butterfly, its vibrant orange wings pinned cruelly in place. The letter from the State Attorney General's office arrived on thick, impressive stationery. Mark read it aloud at the kitchen table, his voice gaining strength with each sentence. It cited the HOA for egregious and willful violation of the state's Right to Landscape Act. It ordered an immediate cessation of all fines, threats, and legal actions against the Martinez family. It demanded the HOA revise its covenants to comply with state law within 60 days or face significant daily penalties. It was a complete and total vindication. Elena felt the tension that had been coiling in her shoulders for months, loosened by a single precious degree. "It's over," she whispered, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. Mark grabbed her, spinning her in a small, joyful circle in the kitchen. "We won, Lena. We actually won." But the victory was immediately complicated. News of the state's intervention traveled fast. A reporter from the local paper called within the hour. By that afternoon, a satellite truck from a San Antonio news station was parked at the end of their street, its bulky presence an alien invader in the manicured neighborhood. Elena gave a brief, nervous interview on her porch, the camera lens a giant, unblinking eye. She spoke about water conservation, about supporting local ecosystems, about the importance of property rights. She was careful, polite, and did not mention the harassment, the vandalism, or the dead plant. She didn't need to. The story wrote itself. Plucky homeowner versus tyrannical HOA, with the mighty state riding to the rescue. The spotlight was a shield. The anonymous calls and mail subscriptions stopped. The keyed car would be the last act of covert aggression, they felt sure. Nobody would be stupid enough to act out under the gaze of the media. That evening, they allowed themselves to feel it. They opened a bottle of wine and sat on the porch, watching the fireflies blink over the native lantana. The garden seemed to glow with a triumphant light, each plant a silent soldier that had held the line. "We should celebrate," Mark said, squeezing her hand. "Really celebrate. We'll go out to dinner this weekend, somewhere nice." It was then that Elena noticed it. A small, dark smudge on the fresh white paint of the front door, just above the camera's field of view. She walked over, her heart beginning a familiar, sickening rhythm. Pinned to the wood with a tiny, vicious tack was a monarch butterfly. It was perfectly intact, its wings spread as if in flight, a specimen of exquisite beauty subjected to a cruel and petty death. It was a message that bypassed lawyers and AGs and news cameras. It was a whisper in the dark, a reminder that the law could rule on paper, but it could not control the human heart. A sob caught in Elena's throat. This wasn't a threat against her property. It was a desecration of the very symbol of why she had fought. The monarch, the reliant migrant that needed native milkweed to survive. Mark was beside her, his celebratory mood vaporized. "I'll get the ladder," he said, his voice grim. "I'll take it down." "No," Elena said, her voice stronger than she felt. She reached up and carefully, reverently unpinned the beautiful broken creature. She cradled it in her palm. "They meant for this to scare me, to show me that they can still touch what I love." She looked from the butterfly in her hand to her garden, then down the street to the dark, silent windows of the houses that harbored her enemies. "They think this is an end, a final screw you," she said, "but it's not." She went inside and returned with a small, simple shadow box. She gently placed the butterfly inside, a silent, perfect testament to the cost of this war. The next morning, she went to the nursery. She didn't buy a replacement Turk's cap. She bought 6 swamp milkweed plants, the primary host for monarch caterpillars. She planted them in a prominent spot near the sidewalk, a bold, living defiance. A week later, the first email arrived. It was from David Chen. "My wife and I were inspired. Could you help us design a native border for our backyard? The HOA. Can't say no now, right?" Then another from a woman on the next street over. Then another. Elena Martinez became an unlikely consultant. She spent her weekends walking through neighbors' yards, sketching plans, sharing plant lists. Chloe Miller's yard was the first conversion, a beautiful mix of black-eyed Susans and bluebonnets that had her neighbors stopping to admire. The change was not universal. Cynthia Carlyle and her core group remained, their hatred now a cold, permanent frost. They would never be friends, but the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. The state's ruling had given them the law. Elena's resilience gave them courage. She stood on her porch one evening, watching a monarch butterfly, a live one, flit from milkweed to mistflower. The shadow box, with its single sad specimen, hung in her living room, a reminder of the price of conviction. The law had overruled the HOA, but that was just the beginning. The real victory, she realized, was not in winning the right to her own garden. It was in slowly, patiently helping others grow their own. It was the right to root, not just for plants, but for change. And that was a victory no anonymous note could ever pin down. They said my yard was an eyesore, a blight on the neighborhood. They sent letters, then fines, then threats. But I refused to surrender my little patch of wilderness. I knew the law was on my side. I just didn't know the cost of winning would be measured in more than legal fees. The first anonymous note slipped under my door was chillingly simple. Uproot it, or we will. The first notice from the Silver Oaks Homeowners Association arrived on a Tuesday, nestled between a cable bill and a seed catalogue. It was printed on crisp, official letterhead. Elena Martinez barely glanced at it as she carried the mail inside, her mind still buzzing with the day's work as a landscape architect. She tossed the stack on the kitchen counter and went straight to the sink, pouring a tall glass of water. From her window, her view was not of a manicured lawn, but a thriving, buzzing, blooming tapestry of life. Her yard was her masterpiece, her rebellion, her sanctuary. Gone was the resource-guzzling monoculture of St. Augustine grass the previous owners had struggled to maintain. In its place was a low-water, hyperlocal ecosystem. Vibrant purple clusters of Greg's mist flower, the cheerful yellow blooms of Engelmann's daisy, the delicate fronds of inland sea oats, and the rugged beauty of Texas sage. It was a landscape that belonged here, in the heart of the hill country, not some imported fantasy of an English lawn. It thrived on rainfall alone, provided a critical habitat for pollinators, and filled the air with the gentle hum of bees and the flitting dance of butterflies. She finally opened the HOA letter. Her eyes scanned the formal language, her smile fading, replaced by a cold knot of disbelief in her stomach. Violation of Covenant 7, Section 2. All front yards must be landscaped with maintained, approved turf grass. Presence of unapproved vegetation deemed to be weeds and uncontrolled growth constitute a nuisance and an eyesore, negatively impacting community property values. You have 30 days to bring the property into compliance or face fines of $100 per day until the issue is remedied. An eyesore? A nuisance? Elena's hand trembled. The paper rattling softly, she looked out the window again. She saw a goldfinch alight on a coneflower, its bright yellow a perfect match to the petals. She saw the intricate, beautiful order in what they willfully perceived as chaos. Anger, hot and sharp, rose in her throat. This wasn't just about grass. It was about control, about a bland, homogenized ideal that left no room for individuality or ecological sense. She thought of the hours she'd spent carefully selecting each plant, amending the soil, watching this haven emerge from the barren, chemical-dependent turf. It wasn't just a yard. It was a statement, a principle. Her first instinct was to call her husband, Mark, but he was still at his office in the city, and she could already picture his weary sigh. The pragmatic lawyer in him would see this as a simple dispute to be resolved through channels. He'd talk about picking battles, but this was her battle. She felt it in her bones. She took a deep breath, the scent of mountain mint from a vase, on the counter filling her senses, calming her. No, she would not be bullied. She knew her rights. The state had passed a right-to-landscape law precisely to prevent HOAs from forcing homeowners to waste water on thirsty lawns. She had done her research before she'd ever put a trowel to dirt. With renewed determination, she sat down at her laptop. She drafted a polite but firm response. She cited the state law, Chapter 202 of the Property Code. She attached photographs of her yard, highlighting the native species and their benefits. She included a list of the plants, their water needs, and their value to the local ecosystem. She emailed it to the HOA management company and CC'd the entire HOA board, a list of names she knew well from community newsletters. The Carlyles, the Robinsons, old Mr. Gable. The response was not what she hoped for. It came not from the management company, but from HOA board president Cynthia Carlyle herself. Her email was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive hostility. "Dear Elena," it began, a false familiarity that set Elena's teeth on edge. "We appreciate your enthusiasm for alternative landscaping. However, the covenants and restrictions you agreed to upon purchasing your home are quite clear. The state law you reference does not invalidate our legally recorded CC&Rs. Our community standards exist for the enjoyment and benefit of all homeowners, and your current landscape does not meet those standards. The compliance deadline stands." Eleanor read the email 3 times. The cold finality of it was a slap. They hadn't even considered her arguments. They had simply shut her down. That evening, she showed Mark the letters. His face grew serious as he read. "Okay," he said, putting an arm around her. "This is annoying, but we'll handle it. I'll have my paralegal pull the property codes. We'll send a more strongly worded letter. They're just trying to intimidate you." But as darkness fell, Eleanor stood on her porch, looking at the shadowy forms of her plants swaying in the gentle breeze. The scent of damp earth and night-blooming flowers was usually a comfort. Tonight, it felt like the calm before a storm. This was more than intimidation. It was a declaration of war. And, as she looked out at her hard-won Eden, she knew with a sinking certainty that the first shot had been fired.